are the four players that the Indiana Fever should core to make sure that no team can touch them heading into the expansion. Remember, you just lose these players straight up. You don't get anything back for the players. They're gone. We didn't get anything for Temi, did we? No.
Welcome back to Basketball Zone X WNBA fans. This is a story you're definitely going to want to hear. A major controversy is surrounding the Indiana Fever, with reports claiming that Stephanie White has made a shocking move involving 5 Fever players following alleged locker room drama. Let's get into the video. The Indiana Fever have dominated social media feeds and headlines, making them the talk of the town. People are talking about them everywhere you look. The future of sports bars is a topic of much discussion. Podcasts analyze every action, and after every game, Twitter goes crazy. However, what if the true narrative isn't taking place on the court? What if all of the amazing plays, victories, and defeats we've been witnessing have only served as a diversion from the true drama taking place behind closed doors? Whispers of a broken locker room have swelled into a roar that cannot be ignored or written off as mere rumors. Behind the highlight reels, post-game interviews, and meticulously planned news conferences, it appears that head coach Stephanie White has finally taken action, carrying out a strategy that may have taken months to develop, with the abrupt and deliberate removal of 4 players in quick succession. If you appreciate this content, consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. Believe it or not, more than 90% of viewers haven't subscribed yet. It's free and only takes a second, but it means the world to us. So, did you subscribe already? Great, thank you so much for your support. Now, back to the video. However, was this about strategic roster formation and team building, the kind of difficult choices championship organizations have to make? Or was it a last-ditch effort to take back command of a squad on the verge of total disintegration? A desperate attempt to save a failing season? As the Fever's internal conflicts have started to come to light, the basketball community has been observing with a mix of intrigue, worry, and morbid curiosity. What began as hazy rumors muttered in arena hallways and unverified reports from unidentified sources has developed into a full-fledged organizational catastrophe that might ruin what many thought would be the franchise's pivotal season. Everyone's question is straightforward but significant. What actually took place in Indianapolis? We must go back in time to comprehend the current crisis. This wasn't always the case for the Indiana Fever. They were among the top teams in the league a few years ago, a shining example of reliability and professionalism. Championship banners were displayed in their arena. Although their fan base was devoted and fervent, professional sports are harsh, and the Fever finally had to face the truth that all organizations must face, reconstruct, or become obsolete. The decision to hire Stephanie White wasn't made hastily. The front office analyzed countless hours of film from her previous coaching stints, conducted in-depth interviews, and consulted with league insiders. White had a stellar background, having excelled at several levels of basketball. Having previously played and coached in Indiana, she was familiar with the state's market. She was believed to be capable of restoring the defensive identity and discipline that had once defined Fever basketball. Drafting generational talent was another important decision the team made at the same time. On draft night, the audience exploded when Caitlin Clark's name was called. Supporters felt a renewed sense of optimism. Headlines appeared across the media. Meanwhile, the front office saw dollar signs, ticket sales, jersey sales, revenue, and appearances on national television. Clark represented everything modern basketball had evolved into: dynamic, imaginative, unconventional, and completely captivating to watch. But during those exuberant moments, no one really stopped to think about this. What happens if a player who thrives on chaos is paired with a coach who values structure? What happens if you build a team around a superstar but hire a coach who doesn't believe superstar treatment is appropriate? These exact decisions planted the seeds of the current disaster. Choices that initially appeared wise but eventually proved to be fundamentally incompatible. If you knew where to look, you could see the warning signs of trouble, subtle at first, but becoming more noticeable every week. For weeks before the scandal became widely known, seasoned reporters and league insiders who had followed the WNBA for years and developed a sense of when something wasn't right had been noticing subtle signs. On the surface, to the uninformed spectator watching games on TV, it seemed like the squad was simply adjusting to a new system and going through the typical growing pains that come with adding new players. This is something every team experiences, right? It takes time for new players to become familiar with the playbook. Chemistry takes time to develop. Coaches need time to learn their staff and figure out rotations. These are the cliches that permeate post-game press conferences following dismal defeats, the promises that front offices offer to worried supporters. However, those who visited practices, chatted with team members, and had access to the organization's inner workings revealed something much more concerning: a fundamental conflict between philosophies and styles that was destroying the team's cohesiveness. Coach Stephanie White, who's well known in the basketball community for her harsh, defense-minded style and straightforward manner, was now in charge of a squad that included some of the game's most explosive offensive players. Discipline, structure, and a relentless possession-by-possession mindset that had benefited her throughout her coaching career were all highlighted in her resume. She prioritized defense, believing that every point should be earned by the opposition. She supported offensive schemes in which each player knew their position and performed it flawlessly. She respected authority and believed in hierarchy. However, this went beyond differences in tactics or strategies, the type of dispute that could be settled through adaptation or compromise. This was a fight for the team's very essence. Indianapolis's practices and film sessions became a philosophical battle: innovation versus experience, organization versus freedom, and old school versus new school. This war would also result in casualties, just like any other. Anyone watching closely could feel a strain. During timeouts, body language told a story of disconnect that words never could. During defensive instructions, players would nod while pretending to listen, but during offensive setups, they would look at each other and communicate silently. When a play was called, some players would groan, and when a teammate attempted a shot that wasn't in the system, others would suddenly shake their heads. During games, the atmosphere on the bench varied greatly, indicating a team that was anything but cohesive. After a spectacular defensive stop, everyone would be standing and applauding. Then, during an offensive highlight, half of the bench would remain seated and merely applaud in passing. Longtime league veterans could see what was going on. They recognized the symptoms because they had previously been on dysfunctional teams. A coaching staff that struggled to retain control, players forming rival camps, and heated interactions behind closed doors were all reported by sources close to the group. According to one report, White regularly halted play to adjust offensive positioning during a practice session, but a player quickly realized that the incorrect positioning had resulted in an open shot. Another recounted a film session in which the room was literally and figuratively split, with some players sitting in the front rows and nodding along with White's points, while others sat in the back, obviously disengaged with their arms crossed. In an effort to control the issue, the front office met privately with important players, hired sports psychologists to address team chemistry, and even sought advice from other coaches in the league regarding how to deal with strong personalities. However, the truth had a way of leaking out, much like water finding its way through a dam's crevices. Something had to give, eventually, before the pressure building beneath the surface erupted in a way that was impossible to ignore or explain away. The internal conflict started to show up as the season went on in ways that were impossible to conceal. The Fever's on-court performance became more erratic, alternating between decisive wins and puzzling defeats. They would appear to be a serious contender for the championship one night. Their offense clicking with accuracy and their defense stifling rivals. Then they would struggle against teams they should have been able to defeat with ease, appearing disorganized and uninspired. Interviews conducted after games turned into exercises in reading between the lines. White would express her frustration with players who weren't buying in, talking about her dedication to the system and doing things the proper way. Players would give thoughtful answers about how they were still learning to play together and figuring things out, diplomatic words that only exacerbated the underlying frustrations. As the subtext became apparent, the media started asking more probing questions concerning coaching philosophy and squad cohesion. Social media turned into a battlefield where the conflict manifested itself subtly. Players who used to communicate frequently online abruptly stopped liking each other's posts. Some players would post inspirational sayings about staying true to oneself or refusing to let other people dull your light. Messages that appeared to be aimed at a particular person or situation. When fans noticed these trends, they started creating in-depth threads that examined who attended whose parties, who was in whose social circle, who appeared to be genuinely happy, and who seemed to be going through the motions. Behind the scenes, the gap was becoming harder to overlook according to several people who spoke on condition of anonymity. Team meetings became hostile and ineffective. White would present strategies that prioritized controlled defense and defensive stops. Even while some players supported a more rapid-fire, freedom-based strategy, neither side was prepared to make a complete concession because they each believed their own approach was the best way to achieve success. According to reports, the coaching staff was divided. White's assistant coaches supported her defensive strategies and methodical approach because they were committed to her vision. However, other assistants, especially those who had been with the organization longer, privately voiced concerns that the approach wasn't making the most of the offensive talent on the roster. Players became aware of the lack of cohesive messaging as a result of the coach's internal conflicts. The discomfort during practice sessions increased. Routine drills turned into controversial exercises. White would spend hours practicing defensive positioning and rotations which some players felt were suffocating and overly coached. When the squads scrimmaged, the games would frequently turn into displays of individual skill rather than cooperative play. The front office was put in a difficult situation, as certain players were eager to demonstrate the viability of their freestyle strategy. They had made significant investments in both their top players and White. They couldn't simply fire a newly appointed coach. They were also unable to give up the skills they had used to establish the franchise. In an effort to mediate and establish common ground, they met separately with White and important stakeholders, attempting to thread the needle. However, mediation is only effective when both sides are eager to reach an agreement. Furthermore, It appeared as though both parties had firmly established their views and were hesitant to change them. Veteran players who had experienced similar circumstances in the past started to voice their concerns about the future of the situation, albeit in private. They had witnessed teams disintegrate in the past, and they had seen promising seasons ruined by internal conflict. They made an effort to mediate disputes between the factions by acting as peacemakers, but they ended up feeling increasingly alone and unwelcome by both sides. Everyone was being forced to take a side as the middle ground disappeared. The first domino fell quickly without warning and with the intention of sending shockwaves across the league and the organization. A clear and unequivocal message was conveyed by the release of a key role player who had been part of the team's core rotation, logged substantial minutes, and was regarded as a strong contributor both on and off the court. Get in line or leave. There would be no more warnings or opportunities to make adjustments. Everyone was unprepared for the timing. It wasn't the offseason when roster changes are more predictable and understandable. Emotions couldn't account for a hasty decision just after an especially devastating loss. It was all the more startling because it occurred during what appeared to be a fairly steady period. In a quick meeting, the player was told they would be released, given a brief explanation, and led out of the building. Their time with the Fever ended abruptly. While the official line from the front office was about performance metrics, roster optimization, and going in a different direction, the normal corporate jargon that accompanies such moves, in league circles, rumors circulated that presented an entirely different picture. Sources within the organization who spoke in condition of anonymity claimed that this player had been an outspoken opponent of White's coaching style and the team's direction. They hadn't kept their worries to themselves or confided only in close friends. They had raised concerns about tactics they believed were outdated and inflexible at team meetings. This player had become more outspoken in team meetings, criticizing defensive tactics that appeared to restrict the team's offensive creativity, according to insiders who spoke on condition of anonymity. They were said to have taken on the role of spokesperson for a growing faction of dissent, speaking up for those who felt similarly confined but were reluctant to speak out. The release was a classic power play, a warning shot fired across the bow of a divided locker room. According to reports, they had stated things like, "This isn't how modern basketball works anymore," and we're wasting talent trying to play a system from 20 years ago. It was White's way of proving that criticism would not be accepted, that her authority was unassailable, and that allegiance to her system could not be compromised. The message was obvious. It made no difference how well you performed, how well liked you were by the team, or how long you had been a member. You were disposable if you disagreed with the coach's vision. The timing of this initial action was especially important. It appeared out of nowhere, surprising even seasoned observers, rather than during the turmoil of the season's beginning, or at a natural breaking point like the All-Star break. This suggested that White and the front office had been preparing their response, keeping watch, documenting incidents of disagreement, and building a case. They had been deliberate and patient, allowing the dissenting voices to fully express themselves before taking action. There were reportedly shocked and frightened reactions in the locker room. The released players' teammates were devastated. When they received the news, some people began crying openly, but fear was more prevalent than grief. If this player could be released, anyone could. Talent, production, and connections within the organization were no longer enough. Compliance was the only thing that mattered. Some players reached out privately to the released player, offering support and expressing confusion over the decision. Others publicly supported the organization's choice, posting on social media about trusting the process and remaining committed to the team's goals, whether out of self-preservation or genuine agreement with the move. Everyone noticed these public displays of loyalty, suggesting that those players were firmly in White's camp. The release received widespread but ultimately superficial media attention. Reporters relied on speculation and statistical analysis to determine whether the player's production warranted a roster spot, since they were unable to learn the real reasons behind the move. However, those who paid closer attention realized that numbers had little to do with this situation. Power, control, and sending a message were at stake here, and the message had been clearly understood. Soon after, 2 more players were dismissed in quick succession, in moves that seemed almost scripted. There was barely enough time for the initial shock to subside before the second release, which occurred just 3 days after the first. Less than a week later, the third followed. On their own, these roster changes might have gone unnoticed as standard midseason adjustments, or the kind of roster maneuvering any team makes when things aren't going well. Players are frequently released by teams. It's a normal part of the business. Sometimes a player simply doesn't fit the system. Occasionally, when another player takes over, their position becomes unnecessary. There are also situations involving plans to sign someone else or financial considerations. Any of these moves, taken separately, could have been justified as regrettable but necessary business decisions. However, when taken as a whole, they depicted something far more intentional and alarming. This was a coach deliberately eliminating voices that questioned her authority and dismantling a group of dissenters. It was brutally effective, deliberate, and targeted. White wasn't simply changing the roster, she was carrying out a purge, removing everyone she believed posed a challenge to her authority. The Fever had been troubled for weeks before these moves by whispers of cliques and a breakdown in team cohesion. During team meals, players were allegedly seated at separate tables, a classic indication of a divided locker room. The star players were seated at one table, the newcomers at another, and the veterans at a third. However, age and experience weren't the true dividing factors. It was about ideology. Those who agreed with White's strategy were represented by one table, while those who questioned it were represented by another. There had been a noticeable decline in several teammates' social media interactions. For those paying attention, this was another telltale indicator. Players who used to frequently leave comments on one another's posts suddenly stopped. Certain player combinations were conspicuously absent from the carefully selected group photos. Instead of the genuine camaraderie that defines successful teams, the usual chemistry seemed artificial, staged, and performed for the cameras. After successful plays during games, players would hug one another, but the celebrations felt forced and artificial rather than natural. By removing what she believed to be the source of the problem before it could spread and contaminate the entire roster, Stephanie White appeared to be performing surgery on her team through these consecutive releases. With surgical precision, she was removing the problem players, those she believed were undermining her authority and contaminating the culture. League sources claim that one of these players had a strong relationship with the first player removed, indicating that their dismissal was more about severing connections than on-court performance. They had formed a genuine bond that went beyond basketball, had been roommates on road trips, and were frequently seen together before and after practices. White viewed them as dangerous because of their friendship. They could reinforce each other's skepticism about the system because two voices are louder than one. In fact, they had performed well on the court. They were playing solid defense, shooting a respectable percentage, and carrying out their responsibilities as outlined in the team's offensive plan. However, that was no longer relevant. Poor performance wasn't their crime, it was loyalty to the wrong person. White was sending another message by letting them go. You won't be protected by your relationships. Your friendships don't matter. Your relationship with me and my system is the only relationship that counts. According to reports, the other player removed in this wave had been heard grumbling to teammates about playing time and role definition, creating what White saw as a poisonous atmosphere of individualism and entitlement. They believed they should have greater freedom to make plays, a larger role in the offense, and more opportunities to showcase their abilities. In private discussions, they had questioned why everything had to go through such a regimented system, why the team's offense was so rigid, and why players weren't allowed to freelance more. Although these grievances might have been legitimate from a basketball standpoint, they represented a serious challenge to White's authority. The ability of a coach to determine roles and playing time is ultimately what gives them authority. Players who undermine those decisions challenge the entire hierarchy that allows coaching to function. Without risking the loss of control, White couldn't allow these questions to continue. Everyone who remained on the roster was beginning to understand the message. In order to pursue something she believed in more, White was prepared to sacrifice depth, experience, and even talent, total adherence to her methods, and complete unity under her vision. The team was becoming thinner, less talented on paper, and more vulnerable to setbacks or injuries. However, White believed that a less gifted team, completely committed to her system, was better than a highly talented team that was divided and disobedient. It was a high-risk strategy that could either leave the Fever dangerously thin and vulnerable, or create an unbreakable team identity. The remaining players might develop the kind of chemistry and trust necessary to overcome skill deficiencies if they fully embraced White's defensive methods and methodical offense. They could become one of those teams that outperform more talented opponents by playing harder and more cohesively. However, the Fever could enter a downward spiral as the Purge had the opposite effect. If it created fear and resentment instead of buy-in, players might stop playing with the enthusiasm and creativity required for success because they were too focused on protecting themselves and worrying about saying or doing the wrong thing. The group could become robotic, lacking passion, and eventually ineffective. At least publicly, the coaching staff allegedly supported these actions wholeheartedly. In conversations with players, assistant coaches backed White's decisions, emphasizing that everyone had to commit to the team's disciplined approach and defensive identity. However, sources claim that some assistants expressed doubts privately. They were concerned about the lack of depth on the roster. They questioned the remaining players' ability to perform at a high level. Above all, they wondered whether the psychological damage caused by the Purge could ever be completely repaired.